Okay, let's try this again. Sorry, everyone. Welcome to the last episode of Niche Conversations for season 4. We had a little hiccup there, or my toddler is being randomly dropped off when I didn't expect her to be. But Grandpa is holding on to her, so we can speak with Siobhan right now. I'm going to invite Siobhan. Is the what happens when you do live interviews? Is that random things happen? So just roll with the flow, but we're going to be talking about this book. So, hello, Siobhan. So sorry about that, but we're here.
It's no problem. I'm happy to be here.
Excellent. Welcome to Niche Conversations. I am Jessica DeWitt, one of the editors here at the network in Canadian History and Environment. And today we are joined by Siobhan Angus. Please tell us about yourself.
I'm so excited to be here and speaking with you today, Jessica. My name is Siobhan Angus. I'm an assistant professor of media studies at Carleton University.
Awesome. Yeah, so you published a book recently.
Yes.
Camera Geologica, an elemental history of photography, which is fantastic, everyone. And that's what we're going to be chatting about today. And I'm so glad that you could join us. And I guess we'll just roll into it. First off, when I was reading this book, I found myself it made me very reflective on my own relationship to photography. And it made me think of my parents aren't into photographs and stuff, so all of our family photos and stuff were just in this random box when I was growing up, but I was obsessed with them, and I would just sit and touch them and look at them for hours from a very, very young age. And it just made me feel materially connected to my ancestors and younger versions of my parents and younger versions of myself. And I just found myself thinking about those photographs a lot. So I wondered if we could start by talking about your own relationship to photography and whether that kind of drove you into this research.
Yeah, I love your sort of observation about sort of the materiality and the material memory,
Mm-hmm.
because I think that for me, when writing it, that's one of the things that made photography a really powerful entry point into the conversation, right? The sort of broader deconstruction of the many, many ways that extraction is sort of woven through and structures our lives and the
Mm-hmm.
sort of conditions of political possibility. And so, for listeners who aren't familiar with the book, at the root, the core sort of premise of the book is that photography begins underground, and in photographs of mines and mining, frequently returns there. So, in this, I'm thinking about the use of mined materials as light sensitive materials, developers, metal plates in photography. Right, if we
Mm-hmm.
think about an analog photograph, most of them are set in silver. That's what sort of forms the physical print. So really trying to center those histories. And so it's this material and social connection between mining and photography that really lies at the heart of the book. But interestingly, I actually came to this project through mining, not through photography.
Cool.
So I'd been sort of writing and thinking about mining for a long time, and but found that sort of in the process of that research, I kept being drawn to the work of artists. And I found that, mining can be a sort of depressing history to study, right?
Yeah.
There's a sort of, these histories of environmental harm, of labor degradation, and this sort of challenge of thinking of an alternative, right? Like what's outside of it. And so, sort of in these processes of research and writing, was frequently going back to the work of artists,
Mm-hmm.
especially photographers. And so, I think that, there's something about, especially in photography, because there's this incredibly tangible material connection, which
Yeah.
actually a lot of contemporary artists have really kind of worked with and thought with, to kind of go back to these histories and sort of bring them into visibility in the present and think about these contemporary histories of extraction. So it seems like photography was a really powerful way of rethinking some of our kind of assumptions about it. And then in turn, sort of rethinking the medium of photography through this sort of very labor centric, kind of environmentally grounded history. So in
Mm-hmm.
many ways, it's a love letter to photography, right? A sort of,
Yeah.
sideways one, because in some ways, it charts these more complicated histories. But in doing so, I think proposes that photography has something really powerful to tell us about how our world is made.
Mm-hmm.
And the work of art and artists plays a really important role in the context of environmental justice.
Yeah. Awesome. Yeah. Brilliant. Okay. So you've kind of touched about it in that answer, but like, I wonder if you could just maybe more specifically tell us what is different about an elemental history of photography. How is it different from other histories of photography that one might read?
When we think about photography, we think about light, right? It's in the name. Photography means
Mm-hmm.
written with light. And light has a number of associations that shape sort of standard understandings of photography, right? These metaphors of immediate transparency, the window, the mirror, the lens. Ideas of photographic truth often rest on a conception of light as a force that illuminates and clarifies the world around us, though in reality, light just as often distorts or obscures. And then this idea of the sort of autogenic creativity of the sun, which shifts attention away from labor. And so beneath all of these narratives that run through the history of photography is this fantasy of weightlessness, right? Of
Mm-hmm.
transcending the limits and expenses of matter, the limits to growth, and often, right, aligning these histories of labor, which are so important. So light is obviously really important to photography, but it's only part of the story.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm interested in what histories resurface if we think about the mine and the elements that come from the mine as being central to the history of photography. So rather than this idea of sun creating images without human labor, which we hear so much about in photographic discourse,
Yeah.
right? What would a history of photography look like that thought about the miner as a key player in the production of photography?
Yeah.
So it's an attempt to restore photography back to histories of labor, empire, colonization, and environment. And so from this core premise, the book moves between geographies and time periods, primarily the 19th
Mm-hmm.
and the 21st centuries, to trace the use of 6 different mined materials that have been used in photographic processes. So bitumen, silver, platinum, iron, uranium, and rare earth elements. So materials become the organizing structure of the book, and the focus is on how these materials have been integrated into the workings of the sort of industrial extractive capitalism.
Mm-hmm.
And, in turn, what these images tell us about how this sort of structures our world. So it kind of more broadly, I suppose, the elemental argument sort of proposes reorienting our understanding of art and culture, like through extraction. Because I think that photography has a really important role to play in these kind of larger environmental questions in the moment, but to play an activist role in the context of environmental justice, I feel like these intimate links to extraction need to be more thoroughly understood.
Mm-hmm.
So it just sort of surfaces histories that are already there and that artists have done a lot of work to kind of bring into view.
Mm-hmm. Cool. Yeah, I one thing I really love about being a historian is that it really enables me to sit and trace all these complex connections. Like that's what I always say about people is like history is like learning about how we're connected to other people, whether through time, through space, what have you, and to other beings, right? And to non-human things like minerals and like what your book is showing, right? And it's just, I think your book is such a brilliant example of that really brings those connections, these connections that we don't think about a lot to the fore and like puts them in your face and like yes, like all of this is so connected, all of that you can't divorce anything from one another. Like it's just it's fascinating. I love it. I love history, and this book is great for that. uh, and one thing about the book that is so strong is that it's really rooted in visuals, which I think also makes it a bit more accessible to some people who maybe aren't trained historians. I think when you bring in the visual, it helps people connect on a personal level. So I was wondering, how you came about like choosing these images. Like, did you think of the elements that you're going to focus on and then find images that were going to be examples of that? Or did the images kind of inform the way that the book developed?
That's a really great question. And I love your sort of reflection on history as reconnecting work, because that's exactly how I sort of thought about the book. It's like, there's
Mm-hmm.
all of these threads that sort of link these things that we consider very separate, but are actually very
Yeah.
integrated. And a lot, I think, comes to light once we just, put these threads back together. And
Mm-hmm.
so the project actually originally began as a dissertation on silver and photography. So just looking at one element. But while I was working on the dissertation, I met two artists whose work ended up being in the book. Susanna Kreeman, who's working on uranium and extraction, and Warren Cariou, who makes photographs of bitumen
Yeah.
from the tar sands. And in many ways, I think Warren's practice is the sort of scaffolding of the book.
Mm-hmm.
But talking with them and sitting with their practices sort of opened up the structure that would become the book. So this kind of more iterative structure that looked at the use of different mine materials in different time periods and geographies. And so methodologically, what the book tries to do is bridge the sort of close material and visual reading of objects with the knowledge of the sort of material processes, in this case, chemistry and photochemistry, with a historically rooted analysis of larger political structures like extraction, empire, colonization.
Mm-hmm.
So grounding those things in the object felt really, really important so that it didn't just kind of like sprawl in a million directions.
Yeah.
And so I think there's some artists who's, have done a lot of that connecting work already. So that made it really productive.
Mm-hmm.
So I had a strong idea about which artist projects I wanted to write about before I started researching. But the material-based structure was the kind of thing that came first. So the six elements and then
Mm-hmm.
finding artists that were working within that. And technically, in terms of research, each chapter began with a really deep dive into the material because I really wanted to think about like material specificity and those particular histories. And then from there, sort of thinking about artist projects that animated the themes introduced by the projects.
Mm-hmm.
There are a few artist projects that I really wanted to include that just didn't fit in the structure, which is too bad because there's some really, really incredible work happening in a lot of different fields. The other thing that kind of shaped the projects that were included was this was a pandemic project. So,
Mm-hmm.
because so much of the book is about materiality, it seemed really important to write about objects that I could see or kind of
Yeah.
analyze. And so some images and archives just were not accessible kind of in that period. Some of the work I'd done kind of before the pandemic started, but that constrained it in some ways. And yeah, ultimately the sort of idiosyncratic question of, which images grab you
Yeah.
and sort of speak to you. And so, from these kind of larger bodies of work, right, which ones do the most conceptual or aesthetic heavy lifting? But I'm looking forward to, sort of writing and thinking with some of the artist projects that didn't make it into the
Yeah.
book that I think contribute, expand the conversation in like so many ways that couldn't be constrained within that format.
Yeah. Yeah. For people watching, this is what the color page is in the center, and then they kind of are referred to in the text. It's really useful, and like props to Duke University for being willing to do this because I know I've taught like I know other people have tried to do like visual books and like they're like two black and white images only or something like that. So it's really nice to have an academic book that's like really does drive home the images and prioritizes them. So thanks, Duke University Press. Yeah, and it's great. And I didn't even know that bitumen beforehand had been used as a element for photography. And I'm writing a book on the oil sands for your middle schoolers right now. So that's like a
Oh,
really cool, like I'm really excited to like include that on a tidbit and like a picture of it. Because I want to talk about, how has bitumen been used in the past other than, energy production, oil
and I think
production. So
those are really important questions, right? It sort of
yeah.
denaturalizes the inevitability that bitumen
Mhm.
then becomes
Exactly.
energy.
Exactly. Yeah, that has its relationship to us is much more
Yeah.
complex and there are other timelines that could have evolved.
And hopefully
But
will.
yes, and hopefully we'll bring them into being by talking about them, right? So
Exactly.
yeah, so I encourage everyone to pick up this book. Our interviewee on the last episode was Mel Hogan, who has been singing the praises of this book on social media. And so Mel and myself recommend it, and so do a bunch of other people. And yeah, you've been on quite the you've a book like spree, like events and stuff, and promoting it. So there seems to be a lot of excitement. So that's cool. And yeah, thanks for joining me today, and congratulations on this. And everyone should check it out.
Thank you so much. It was wonderful to chat.
Yeah. Okay. Take care,
All
Siobhan.
right. Bye,
Bye.
Jessica.
Bye.